started with a plane crash that never should have happened. In 1985, a small Cessna 172 disappeared over a stretch of wilderness in the Appalachian foothills, an area locals ominously call Devil's Hollow. Search and rescue teams scoured the dense forest for weeks, but found no wreckage, no debris, no sign that a plane had ever been there, until 37 years later. In 2022, two hikers stumbled upon a rusted, vine-covered plane deep in the woods, its cockpit smashed and eerily intact at the same time. They reported it to authorities, thinking they'd stumbled upon the lost Cessna. But when the first responders arrived, something was wrong. The tail number didn't match any known missing aircraft. Worse, the plane's interior looked untouched by time. Fresh food in the seat pockets, unexpired water bottles, and a leather flight log dated October 14th, 2023. 1 year into the future, the mystery of the ghost plane hit the news like wildfire, and everyone speculated. Was it a hoax? A time anomaly? But while the headlines rolled in, investigators found something far more terrifying inside the cockpit. The plane's black box was still functional, and when they played back the audio, they discovered the truth wasn't just strange. It was unspeakable. The audio logs began innocuously. The pilot, a man named Lewis Carter, and his passenger, a journalist named Julia Novak, had been flying over Devil's Hollow on a clear afternoon. Lewis joked about the eerie reputation of the area, while Julia laughed nervously, recording for her investigative series on local legends. At first, everything seemed normal. Then halfway through the recording, Lewis's voice changed. "Do you see that?" he muttered, his tone tight with unease. Julia asked what he was talking about, and then there was silence. A long, tense silence broken only by Lewis whispering, "It's moving." The audio grew chaotic. Julia's panicked voice, Lewis shouting about losing control, and a loud grinding noise that filled the black box recorder. At the very end, just before the recording cut out, a third voice spoke. A deep, guttural tone. Its words unintelligible but suffused with malice. The black box abruptly ended, but the investigators weren't done. One of the forensic techs noticed something odd about the plane's logbook. The handwriting changed after the initial entries. It became jagged, frantic, and the entries mentioned things that shouldn't have been possible. "The sky is wrong. There's no horizon. Julia keeps screaming, but I can't see her anymore." The final log entry chilled everyone in the room. "If you find this, don't touch the plane. It's hungry." The investigators sealed off the site, citing safety concerns, but locals began reporting strange sightings near Devil's Hollow. A low hum, like a distant engine, would drift through the trees at night. Some claimed they saw the lights of a plane, impossibly low, weaving through the forest like a predator stalking prey. A few weeks later, a team of paranormal researchers decided to sneak into the site to document the ghost plane. Armed with cameras and recording equipment, they hiked deep into the forest. By morning, none of them had returned. When authorities launched a search for the missing paranormal researchers, they found no sign of them. No tents, no footprints, not even a shred of clothing. It was as though they had never been there. The only clue was a single handheld camera discovered on the forest floor, a mile from the plane's location. The footage it contained would be the final piece of the mystery, or so everyone thought. The recording started with the researchers approaching the plane. They commented on the eerie atmosphere, the unnatural quiet of the forest, and how the trees seemed to lean toward the wreckage, as if guarding it. When Sriwayan the leader of the group, a man named Eric, decided to climb into the cockpit. The camera caught his hesitation as he peered inside. "It looks too new," he muttered, like it just came down yesterday. He reached out to touch the pilot's seat, but one of the others stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Look at the instruments." The camera zoomed in, revealing the altimeter and compass spinning wildly. Then came the sound, a low rhythmic hum, vibrating the air around them. The researchers panicked, backing away from the plane, but Eric froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "It's saying my name." The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the camera began to glitch. The forest around them darkened unnaturally, as though the daylight itself was being swallowed. Shadows began to twist and move, coalescing into shapes that circled the group. One of the researchers screamed, pointing at the plane. Its cockpit light had turned on, casting an unnatural red glow. The shadows surged forward and the camera dropped to the ground. The last frame was of Eric, standing motionless as the shadows enveloped him, his face slack with terror. The screen went black, but the audio continued. The hum had morphed into a deep, guttural voice, repeating a single phrase: "Stay." Authorities immediately cordoned off Devil's Hollow, declaring it off limits to the public. But the disappearances didn't stop. Hikers who strayed too close reported strange lights and heard whispers urging them to come closer. Those who ventured beyond the barriers were never seen again. The final straw came months later, when an entire search and rescue team vanished while investigating another sighting of the plane. The government stepped in, deploying military units to secure the area. Reports surfaced of strange occurrences during the operation, soldiers abandoning their posts, claiming to hear their names whispered in the wind, others who refused to speak about what they'd seen. Today, Devil's Hollow is sealed off completely, and any attempt to enter is met with swift intervention. Officially, it's for public safety, but the locals know better. The plane is still out there, waiting, its hum echoing through the trees. It's not just a ghost of the past. It's a trap, an entity that feeds on those who dare to get too close. And the scariest part? People swear that sometimes, if you stand at the edge of the forest on a quiet night, you can hear it calling your name. It began with a box. Not an ornate, ancient relic or something sealed with a cryptic warning, but a plain, unmarked cardboard box left on the doorstep of the Ridgewood orphanage. The kind you'd expect to find containing old books or forgotten knickknacks. The delivery had no address, no sender, no explanation. When the orphanage staff brought it inside, they assumed it was a donation. Miss Clara, the headmistress, opened it and found a small, battered doll lying on top of a folded piece of yellowed fabric. The doll was old-fashioned, with faded features and a threadbare dress. Underneath the fabric were more toys, wooden blocks, tin soldiers, and a spinning top. It seemed harmless enough, but from the moment the box arrived, the orphanage began to change. The children were the first to notice. Danny, the youngest, refused to play in the common room where the box had been placed. "She doesn't like me," he muttered, pointing to the doll. Clara laughed it off. "It's just a toy," she said, setting it on a shelf. But Danny remained unconvinced, glaring at the doll as though it might leap from the shelf and attack. Over the next few days, strange occurrences mounted. A volunteer working late claimed she heard whispering in the empty common room. Another said the box seemed heavier each time they moved it. One night, a loud crash startled everyone awake. They rushed downstairs to find the shelf tipped over, the doll lying face down on the floor. Clara decided to remove the box, locking it in a storage closet. That night, the screaming began. Ellie, one of the older children, woke up shrieking, clutching her arms as if something had grabbed her. She described a cold hand pulling her toward the closet. When Clara went to investigate, the box was on the floor, the doll staring straight at the door, though she swore she had placed it inside on a high shelf. Frightened, But determined, Clara ordered the box to be burned. 2 of the staff carried it outside to the incinerator, tossing it in with grim determination. They watched as the flames licked the edges of the box, but the doll didn't catch fire. The other toys burned to ash, but the doll sat unscathed amid the embers. They buried it in the woods behind the orphanage. That night, every window in the building shattered simultaneously. The children were terrified, huddling together in the dining hall as Clara and the staff tried to calm them. When they finally retreated to their rooms, Danny began screaming. Clara found him clawing at the walls, shouting, "She's back! She's back!" The doll was sitting on his bed. The orphanage brought in Father Michael, a local priest known for his work with troubled places. He inspected the doll, his face darkening as he listened to Clara's account. He sprinkled holy water on it and began to pray. The air grew thick. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to groan under some unseen weight. The doll trembled, but then it spoke, not in words, but in a voice that each person in the room later described as their own, distorted and filled with malice. It called out their secrets, their fears, and their sins. The priest stopped abruptly, his hands shaking. "This isn't a haunting," he whispered. "This is a curse." Father Michael explained that the doll wasn't possessed but bound by something ancient and malevolent. It fed on despair, anger, and fear, growing stronger with each passing day. To contain it, they needed to return it to where it had come from. But there was no way of knowing who had sent it. The whispers grew louder that night, echoing through the halls. Children complained of shadows moving across their walls, figures standing at the foot of their beds. The staff were plagued by nightmares so vivid they woke up screaming. By the next morning, the doll was gone. And then, the deaths began. Startled awake, Clara found Danny's lifeless body in the common room. His tiny hand clutched the edge of the shelf where the doll had first sat. The police ruled it a freak accident, but Clara knew better. She found the doll in her office, sitting innocently on her desk. One by one, the children started disappearing. Not a trace left behind, just empty beds and the whispers that grew louder with every loss. The staff tried to leave, but the gates wouldn't open. Phones stopped working. It was as if the orphanage had been sealed off from the world, a perfect feeding ground for whatever was tied to the doll. The box had been empty when they found it. Now, Clara suspected, it would never be empty again. Clara couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. The orphanage had become a living nightmare. Shadows flickered on the walls, whispers chased her down hallways, and the children's empty beds weighed heavy on her soul. The doll was everywhere and nowhere. She'd throw it into the woods only to find it sitting on her desk hours later. Every attempt to destroy it ended in failure, and every failure brought a new horror. One night, Clara gathered the courage to face it. She sat alone in the common room, clutching a candle and the rosary Father Michael had left behind when he fled. The doll sat across from her on the floor, its lifeless eyes staring. Clara spoke aloud, her voice trembling but firm. "What do you want?" The doll didn't move, but the room did. The air grew cold, so cold her breath came in visible puffs. The candle flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. A voice answered, not from the doll, but from everywhere at once. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "You!" Clara's mind raced. It wasn't here for the children or the staff. It had been targeting her all along. The deaths, the disappearances, the torment were all a means to an end. It wanted her despair, her guilt, her fear. And it was winning. But Clara wasn't ready to surrender. In the attic, Clara had found an old ledger detailing the orphanage's history. Buried within its brittle pages was a story about a caretaker from decades ago, a woman who had fallen into despair after losing her own child. She had turned to dark rituals, seeking to summon something that could bring her child back. The doll had been her conduit, her offering, and it had cursed the orphanage ever since. Clara realized the doll wasn't just a curse, it was a trap, a tether. It could be bound again, but only by someone willing to sacrifice themselves. The doll appeared on the table before her, as if summoned by her realization. Its head tilted slightly, as if mocking her. Clara clenched the rosary tighter, her knuckles white. "I'll go with you," she whispered, "but all of them." The room stilled, an unnatural silence so complete it felt as though the universe was holding its breath. Then, the doll's head nodded once. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the doll and ran to the basement where the remains of the old ritual circle were etched into the stone floor. She placed the doll in the center and began to chant the words she'd found scrawled in the ledger. The whispers turned into screams, the walls shook, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A hand, dark, clawed, and impossibly large, reached out of the rift. Clara felt it pull at her, dragging her into the void. She screamed, clutching the edge of the circle, but the force was relentless. As she was pulled under, the last thing she saw was the doll's face, now smiling, before the rift sealed itself shut. When the morning light broke, the orphanage was silent. The staff and children slowly emerged from their rooms to find the gates open, the whispers gone, and the oppressive darkness lifted. In the common room, the doll was gone, and on Clara's desk lay a single note, written in her trembling hand. "Keep them safe." Father Michael returned later that day to find the orphanage bustling with life, the children laughing and playing as if nothing had happened. But the staff spoke in hushed tones about Clara's sacrifice and the doll that had disappeared with her. Deep in the woods, buried beneath the roots of an ancient tree, the doll sat waiting. Its smile had widened, and its eyes gleamed faintly in the darkness. It was patient. It would wait for the next soul to stumble upon it, and when they did, the box would never be empty again. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, muffling all sound in the small mountain town of Glenwood. It was the kind of silence that made you feel as though the world had paused. Alan, a freelance journalist chasing urban legends, had come to investigate whispers of the midnight local, a train that supposedly ran through Glenwood's abandoned station, despite the tracks being decommissioned decades ago. Locals spoke of seeing its flickering lights through the dense forest, hearing its whistle in the dead of night, and of people who went to investigate but were never seen again. Alan was skeptical, but the promise of a good story, and the paycheck it promised, was enough to bring him to the derelict station on a frozen January night. He checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. Only 2 minutes until the supposed ghost train would arrive. He stood on the crumbling platform, breath visible in the frigid air, his camera ready. He was alone. No witnesses, no collaborators, just him and the empty tracks. As the clock struck midnight, the silence broke with a distant, echoing whistle. Alan's heart raced as he turned toward the sound. Emerging from the snowstorm, a glowing light appeared down the line. The rumble of wheels on steel tracks grew louder, and within seconds, a train pulled into view. It was a rusted, decrepit locomotive, its paint faded, and its windows shattered. Dim, yellowed lights flickered along its length, casting eerie shadows onto the snow. The train slowed as it approached the platform, but didn't fully stop. Instead, its doors creaked open as it rolled by, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness inside. Alan hesitated, Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, but curiosity, or perhaps some unseen force, held him in place. He stepped forward and, before he could second-guess himself, leapt onto the moving train. The doors slammed shut behind him. The inside of the train was impossibly dark, darker than the night outside. Alan fumbled with his flashlight, and when he turned it on, he wished he hadn't. The interior was rotted and decayed, the seats torn and covered in some black, sticky substance. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and something metallic, like blood. But what truly unnerved him were the faint handprints smeared on the windows, as if left by someone trying desperately to escape. The train jerked violently, throwing Alan into a seat. The windows, now coated in frost, revealed nothing but a swirling black void outside. He had no idea where the train was going, or how long he'd been on it. His watch had stopped working the moment he boarded. Alan stood, gripping the back of a seat for balance as he made his way through the train cars. Each one was worse than the last. In one, the walls were covered in deep claw marks. In another, the floor seemed to breathe, rising and falling like a living thing. The further he went, the louder the whispers became, low, guttural voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. He reached a car where every seat was occupied. At first, he thought they were mannequins, figures slumped forward, their faces obscured. But as his flashlight swept across them, he realized they were people, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Their eyes were open, unblinking, and their mouths twisted in silent screams. He felt the bile rise in his throat as he backed away. "Don't move!" a voice whispered behind him. Alan spun around, flashlight shaking. A man stood in the shadows, his face pale and drawn, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He wore a tattered conductor's uniform. "You shouldn't be here," the man hissed. "No one should." "What is this place? Where is this train going?" Alan demanded, his voice trembling. The conductor stepped closer, his movement stiff and unnatural. "It doesn't go anywhere. It only takes, always takes." Alan backed away, his heart pounding. "Takes what?" "Everything," the conductor said simply. "It'll take you too." The train groaned, and the lights flickered. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. Alan turned to run, but the conductor grabbed his arm with an iron grip. "You can't leave until it's done with you." Desperation surged through Alan as he broke free and ran. The train seemed endless, car after car of horrors he couldn't comprehend. Shadows slithered along the walls, following him, whispering his name. Doors slammed shut behind him, trapping him deeper inside the train's twisted labyrinth. Finally, he stumbled into a car that was completely empty, except for a single glowing lever in the center. Above it was a sign that read, "Pull to stop." Alan hesitated, the whispers clawing at his mind, but the sound of footsteps growing closer spurred him into action. He grabbed the lever and pulled with all his strength. The train screeched, metal grinding against metal as it began to slow. Alan braced himself, expecting the conductor, or worse, to appear. The train came to a jarring halt. The doors creaked open, revealing a snow-covered landscape bathed in the pale light of dawn. Alan didn't wait. He leapt out of the train and into the snow, rolling to a stop as the ground shifted beneath him. When he looked up, the train was gone. The tracks, too, had vanished, leaving only an expanse of untouched snow. Alan staggered to his feet, his body shaking with cold and terror. In the distance, he saw Glenwood Station, the familiar sight, grounding him in reality. But as he stumbled toward it, he froze. In the frost on the station's windows, a handprint appeared, then another, and another. The whispers had followed him back. Alan stared at the frost-covered windows of the station, his breath clouding the air as he backed away. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if dozens of voices were pressing against the walls, eager to be heard. He tried to focus on their words, but they overlapped, their meanings slipping through his grasp like water through fingers. The frost spread unnaturally across the windows, forming shapes that almost resembled faces. Shadows moved behind the glass, faint and indistinct, but unmistakably human in shape. Alan shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just exhaustion, or the trauma of what he had just experienced on the train. But then, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Alan's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to look around. The snow-covered ground was untouched, as if he were the only one who had walked through it. Yet, he felt watched, every instinct screaming at him that he wasn't alone. A faint crunch broke the silence. Alan whipped around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. There, on the edge of the tree line, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows of the early morning light. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching him. Alan's legs refused to cooperate, frozen in place, as the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed at him. His instincts finally broke through the paralysis, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The figure didn't move, but the ground between them began to ripple, as if the snow-covered earth had turned to liquid. "Stay back!" Alan shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural motion that sent a chill down his spine. The rippling ground stopped, but now the air seemed to hum with a low vibration that Alan felt deep in his bones. Desperate for safety, Alan bolted for the station. The whispers resumed, louder and more frantic, as he reached the door and threw it open. He slammed it shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. Inside, the station was as he'd left it, desolate and abandoned. The faint morning light seeped through the cracked windows, illuminating the peeling paint and broken benches. Alan leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath, when he noticed something that hadn't been there before. In the middle of the station's waiting room stood a suitcase. It was old and weathered, its leather straps cracked with age. A tag dangled from one of the straps, and though the ink was smudged, Alan could just make out the letters of his own name. No way, he muttered, inching closer. His name on the tag wasn't written in his handwriting. It was jagged, almost frenzied, like someone had carved it into the surface with a blade. Alan reached out to touch the suitcase, but before his fingers made contact, it snapped open. A sound like 1,000 doors slamming echoed through the station as the lid flew back, revealing a swirling void of darkness inside. The whispers surged again, pouring out of the suitcase, growing louder and louder until Alan had to cover his ears. He stumbled back as a figure began to emerge from the darkness within the suitcase. It was the conductor, his pale face stretched into a grotesque smile. His eyes were hollow, black voids, and his uniform seemed to shift and ripple as if alive. "You can't leave, Alan," the conductor hissed, his voice layered with multiple tones. "You've boarded the train. You belong to it now." Alan's mind raced as he scrambled for a way out. He turned to the door, but when he tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were now coated in a thick frost that obscured any view of the outside world. The station was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. The conductor stepped out of the suitcase, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost as if he were gliding. The void within the suitcase began to expand, creeping across the floor like a living shadow. Alan backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the station. The conductor tilted his head, his smile widening. "It's not about what we want. It's about what you've already given." Alan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't give you anything." "Oh, but you did," the conductor replied, his voice dripping with malice. The moment you stepped onto the train, you gave us your past, your present, and your future. You belong to us, Alan. And now, it's time to pay." The shadows surged forward, tendrils of darkness reaching for Alan. He screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the whispers, now a cacophony of torment. He tried to run, but the shadows coiled around his legs, pulling him toward the suitcase. "No, no, please," Alan begged, clawing at the floorboards. The conductor loomed over him, his hollow eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "This is only the beginning," the conductor whispered as the shadows consumed Alan, dragging him into the void. And then, silence. The station was empty once more. The suitcase sat closed in the middle of the floor, its leather straps pristine as if it had never been opened. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling all sound. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the mountains. Inside the void, Alan felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of weightlessness and despair. The whispers had faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. He opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. The darkness was so complete that it was impossible to tell if his eyes were open or closed. Then, faintly, he began to hear something. It wasn't the chilling whispers that had pursued him before, but a soft, rhythmic thudding. It was the sound of his own heartbeat. He gasped as a single point of light pierced through the blackness, growing brighter and larger with every beat. The light wasn't comforting. It was cold, sterile, and unnatural. As it expanded, it revealed a strange landscape. The void around him wasn't empty. Shapes floated in the air, impossible structures made of twisting organic forms that seemed to pulse and breathe. Alan tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. His body, no longer bound by gravity, drifted toward the light as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. The closer he got, the more the structures around him seemed to move and shift, as though they were alive. And then he saw it. Suspended in the light was something he couldn't comprehend. It was massive and amorphous, a writhing mass of eyes, tendrils, and mouths that all moved independently. The creature, or entity, or whatever it was, radiated an aura of absolute dread. Alan felt its gaze on him, though it didn't have a single definitive face. "Alan," a voice echoed, impossibly deep and resonant. It didn't come from the creature, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." Alan's mind reeled as fragments of memory began flooding back to him. He saw himself boarding the train, but this time, it was different. The station wasn't abandoned. It was bustling with people. He remembered sitting in his seat, reading a book, and then nothing. But now, his mind filled in the gaps. He saw passengers screaming as the train's windows dissolved into swirling voids. He saw the conductor, not as the friendly figure he'd first met, but as the grotesque monster that had emerged from the suitcase. The train wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a trap, a lure designed to feed this thing. "You were chosen, Alan," the voice continued. "Your fear, your despair, they sustain me." "No!" Alan shouted, finding his voice at last. "You can't do this! I didn't choose this!" The entity's tendrils reached toward him, their movements slow and deliberate. It was never your choice. As the tendrils touched him, Alan braced for pain, but instead he felt a jarring sensation, like a switch being flipped. His surroundings shifted, the darkness peeling away like a curtain. He was back in the train, sitting in his seat. The lights flickered above him, and the other passengers were still there, looking as confused and terrified as he felt. "Is it over?" Someone whispered nearby. Alan wanted to answer, but something wasn't right. The train was moving, but the windows showed nothing but an endless expanse of black. And then, as if on cue, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've encountered a slight detour. Please remain seated. This ride will continue forever." The passengers began to panic, their voices rising in fear and confusion. Alan looked down at his hands and his stomach dropped. They weren't his hands. They were aged, gnarled, and pale with long fingers that didn't seem human. He reached up to touch his face and felt the stiff fabric of a conductor's hat. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. But the intercom clicked again, and this time, the voice that spoke wasn't the conductor's. It was Alan's. "Ladies and gentlemen," his own voice echoed, cold and hollow, "welcome aboard." The train jolted, and the passengers screamed as it began to accelerate, hurtling into the void. Alan tried to stand, but his body refused to move. He was no longer a passenger. He was part of the train, its new conductor, bound to continue the cycle for eternity. In the distance, a faint light appeared. Another station. Another soul waiting to board. And this time, Alan would be the one to welcome them. As the train hurtled through the void, Alan's consciousness wavered between panic and despair. He could feel the train's mechanics as if they were an extension of his own body. The groaning of the wheels, the hum of the engine, even the faint vibration of the tracks that didn't exist in this empty expanse. Every motion, every sound was now tied to him. He wanted to scream, to rip himself free, but his body no longer responded to his will. Instead, he found himself stepping into the conductor's compartment, the passengers' panicked cries muffled behind him. The room was eerily pristine, with polished brass levers and glowing dials that seemed to pulsate with a life of their own. In the center was a single control panel, its buttons labeled with strange, indecipherable symbols. Alan stared at his reflection in the glass of the control panel, and his blood ran cold. His face was barely recognizable. His eyes were sunken and devoid of life, his skin pale and stretched unnaturally over his skull. The conductor's hat sat perched on his head, a stark reminder of the transformation he couldn't escape. A voice whispered in his mind, soft, insidious, and far too familiar. It was his own voice, but laced with malice. "You're one of us now, Alan. Accept it." "No!" he growled, clenching his fists. "I won't do this. I won't trap anyone else." The train seemed to respond to his defiance, shuddering violently as if it were angry. The control panel blinked with a rhythmic pattern, its glow intensifying. Alan instinctively reached out to steady himself, but as his hand touched the panel, a surge of images flooded his mind. He saw the passengers in their seats, each one frozen in terror. He saw their thoughts, their memories, their fears. He saw the young woman clutching her phone, desperately trying to reach a loved one who would never answer. He saw the elderly man, silently praying for salvation that would never come. He saw a child, alone and crying, calling for a mother who wasn't there. And then he saw the station ahead. It loomed in the distance, a jagged monolith of light and shadow, flickering like a dying star. Alan could feel the pull of its presence, an irresistible force drawing the train closer. He realized what was happening. The station wasn't just a destination. It was a feeder, a maw ready to consume the souls on board. "Don't fight it, Alan," the voice coaxed. "You'll only make it worse." "No," he whispered, his resolve hardening. "I won't be part of this." He turned to the control panel, his fingers hovering over the buttons. He didn't understand the symbols, but he didn't need to. He could feel their purpose in his mind, a connection forged through his unwilling bond with the train. One button pulsed with a deep, red light, its meaning clear. It was the switch to sever the connection, to end the train's journey. But there was a catch. The train trembled violently as the station loomed closer, its maw opening wider to swallow them whole. The passengers' screams grew louder, a cacophony of despair and hopelessness. Alan knew that pressing the button wouldn't just stop the train, it would destroy it, along with everyone on board, including himself. "You can't save them, Alan," the voice sneered. "This is bigger than you, bigger than them. Accept your place, and it will be easier." Alan clenched his jaw, his trembling hand moving closer to the button. He thought of the passengers, their terrified faces burned into his mind. He thought of his own life, the choices that had brought him here, the people he'd never see again. And then he thought of the next station, the next group of unwitting souls. "I won't let this continue," he said through gritted teeth. With a final surge of defiance, he slammed his hand down on the button. The train screamed. The sound was unlike anything Alan had ever heard, metal grinding against metal, a deafening wail of agony that echoed through the void. The lights flickered wildly and the walls began to splinter and crack. Alan felt his body convulse, his connection to the train tearing away like flesh from bone. The passengers vanished. The train dissolved. The void collapsed around him, folding in on itself with a blinding flash of light. And then there was silence. Alan opened his eyes. He was lying on cold, hard ground, the taste of blood in his mouth. He sat up slowly, his head pounding, his body weak but intact. He looked around, disoriented. He was back at the train station, the same platform where his nightmare had begun. The air was still, the sky a pale gray. There was no sign of the train. He staggered to his feet, his mind racing. Had he stopped it? Were the passengers safe? Or had he simply reset the cycle, ensuring it would happen to someone else? As he stumbled toward the exit, he passed the bench where he had first sat. A newspaper lay there, its headline catching his eye. "Mysterious train disappears. Dozens presumed dead." Alan's heart sank. He picked up the paper, his hands trembling as he read the date. It was the same day he had boarded the train, the same day he had died. A low, familiar rumble echoed in the distance. Alan froze, his blood turning to ice. He turned slowly, his eyes widening in horror. The train was back. Its lights glowed faintly in the distance, the sound of its engine growing louder. It was waiting. And this time Alan knew there was no escape. The rumbling of the train grew louder, reverberating through the empty platform. Alan stumbled back, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what was happening. The realization clawed at him. He hadn't stopped the train. It had merely reset, and it was coming for him once more. The train screeched to a halt at the platform, its doors sliding open with a hiss. The inside was dark, save for faint, pulsing lights that seemed to beckon him. Alan's heart pounded in his chest. He turned to run, but found his legs frozen, rooted to the ground as though the platform itself held him captive. A voice broke through the oppressive silence, low and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot leave, Alan. The journey's not over." He clenched his fists, fighting against the invisible force that held him in place. "I stopped you. I pressed the button. I destroyed the train." The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "You cannot destroy what has no beginning or end. You merely chose to delay." Alan's mind flashed to the passengers, the lives he had tried to save. "Where are they? Did I save them?" "They were spared," the voice replied, almost amused. "But every action has a cost. The train still hungers, Alan. And now it is you who must feed it." The platform began to shift beneath his feet, the ground rippling like water. The train's lights grew brighter, illuminating the platform in an otherworldly glow. Alan's reflection stared back at him from the glass of the train's door. Only it wasn't his reflection. The figure in the glass wore the conductor's uniform, its hollow eyes filled with the same despair he had seen in the faces of the passengers. "No," Alan whispered, shaking his head. "I won't do it. I won't become like you." "You already are," the voice said. "You accepted the role the moment you tried to stop it. The train is bound to you now. Step aboard, and your suffering will end. Resist, and it will consume you anyway." The lights on the train flickered, casting eerie shadows across the platform. Alan felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging him toward the open door. He grabbed onto the edge of the bench, his fingers digging into the metal as he fought to resist. "Why me?" he screamed. "Why does it have to be me?" The voice softened, almost tender. "Because you tried to defy it. You fought against what others accepted. The train needs a conductor, Alan. Someone to guide it through the void. Someone to make the hard choices. You are that someone." Tears streamed down Alan's face as he felt his grip slipping. The pull was relentless, the weight of the train's will pressing down on him like a tidal wave. He thought of the passengers, the lives he had tried to save, and the lives he would doom if he refused. He thought of the countless others who would step onto the train, unaware of the fate that awaited them. "I won't do it," he said through gritted teeth. "I won't be part of this." The voice sighed, a sound of infinite patience. "You don't have a choice, Alan. The train always gets what it wants." With a final wrenching pull, Alan's hands slipped from the bench and he was dragged onto the train. The doors slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. The interior was empty, the rows of seats stretching endlessly into the darkness. The control panel glowed faintly at the front, waiting for him. Alan stood, trembling as the train began to move. The platform disappeared, replaced by the endless void. He walked to the conductor's compartment, his steps heavy with dread. The control panel lit up as he approached, its symbols glowing with an unnatural light. The voice spoke again, softer this time. "Welcome, Alan. Your journey begins now." As he placed his hands on the controls, the train's energy surged through him, binding him to its will. His reflection in the glass changed again, his face fading into something hollow and inhuman. The train's hunger became his own, a gnawing emptiness that could never be filled. Somewhere in the distance, a station loomed, its lights flickering in the void. Alan could feel the presence of new passengers, their fear and desperation calling out to him. The train was coming for them, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The train screamed through the void, its whistle echoing like a mournful cry. Alan's voice joined it, a silent plea lost in the endless darkness. The train always gets what it wants. It was 2:13 a.m. when the hospital's security alarm went off. The small rural medical center, nestled deep in a valley, wasn't used to excitement. There was no hustle of city chaos, no gang disputes, no car chases. Its nights were usually serene, almost eerily quiet, until that moment. Jessica, a night shift nurse with 5 years on the job, froze as the piercing wail shattered the calm. She exchanged a nervous glance with Dr. Patel, who had been reviewing charts in the break room. Security alarms in the hospital didn't just trip for no reason. They were reserved for situations where someone, or something, broke protocol. "Stay here," Patel instructed, but Jessica shook her head. If something was wrong, she wasn't about to wait idly. The two of them crept into the corridor, their steps cautious and quiet. The glow of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every step. The hallway was empty, save for the distant hum of the night shift staff. Jessica's stomach churned. "The ER?" she asked. Patel shook his head. "Came from the morgue." They paused. The morgue alarm wasn't just a security alert. It was a containment breach. Jessica's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios: contamination, or worse, a mistake in labeling. She thought back to the man who had come in hours earlier, a John Doe found at the edge of the forest, dead on arrival. "Let's check the cameras," Patel suggested, pulling out his phone and logging into the hospital's surveillance system. The live feed from the morgue showed the steel drawers slightly ajar, but no one in sight. However, the air seemed heavy, almost warped. "Maybe someone forgot to lock up," Jessica whispered, though even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Patel nodded grimly. They headed toward the elevator, descending into the hospital's cold underbelly. The morgue was colder than usual. Jessica shivered as they stepped inside, her shoes squeaking against the tile floor. The rows of steel drawers gleamed under the fluorescent light. Patel moved toward the main storage bay, inspecting the open compartments. Jessica stayed near the doorway, her gut screaming at her to stay alert. "Drawer 17, Patel said. His voice was tight, uneasy. Jessica didn't respond. She was staring at the floor where a trail of damp footprints, barefoot, led away from the drawer and into the hallway behind her. They weren't there when they entered. "Jessica?" She turned, her face pale. "Something walked out." The words hung in the air as they both realized what she had just said. Patel stepped back, pulling Jessica with him. The door at the far end of the hallway creaked open slowly, the sound grating against their nerves. A chill swept through the morgue, colder than the refrigeration units. The lights flickered. "Hello?" Patel called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the faint echo of a distant shuffle, growing louder. Jessica's breath hitched as the shadow of a figure emerged, swaying as it moved closer. It was the John Doe. His hospital gown was tattered, his skin ashen, with patches of frost clinging to his flesh. His eyes, milky and unfocused, locked onto Jessica. Then he smiled, a grotesque, unnatural curve of the lips that sent a shiver down her spine. "He's supposed to be dead," Patel muttered, backing away. "This is impossible." Jessica's mind screamed for logic. "Maybe he wasn't. Maybe we made a mistake." The John Doe lunged forward, faster than humanly possible. Patel shoved Jessica out of the way as the man collided with him, sending both of them crashing into the equipment tray. Patel screamed as the man's ice-cold hands gripped his neck, pinning him to the floor. "Help me!" Patel choked out, his eyes wide with terror. Jessica grabbed the nearest object, a metal scalpel tray, and swung it at the man's head. It connected with a sickening crack, and he collapsed to the side. Patel gasped for air, scrambling to his feet. The man twitched, his limbs contorting unnaturally as he began to rise. His movements were disjointed, puppet-like, as though some unseen force pulled his strings. "We need to run," Jessica said, pulling Patel toward the door. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed them. The only sound was their frantic breathing and the slow, deliberate scraping of bare feet against the tile. "Upstairs," Patel whispered, "we... Jessica screamed, dragging Patel away from the elevator and back toward the stairs. They bolted upward, slamming through the door to the third floor. Behind them, the sound of shuffling grew faster, more erratic. Jessica slammed the stairwell door shut, fumbling to lock it. "What is he?" Patel asked, clutching his side. This isn't possible." Jessica didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the man was dead. And yet he wasn't. She thought of the strange frost, the warped footage on the cameras, and the unnerving smile that seemed etched onto his face. And then she remembered the note. When they had first examined the John Doe, a small piece of paper had been tucked into the folds of his gown. She had dismissed it as junk, but now her mind latched onto the faint memory of the scribbled words, "Do not let me wake." They had failed to heed the warning. The shuffling outside the door stopped abruptly. Silence fell, oppressive and deafening. Jessica and Patel exchanged a glance, their breaths shallow and quick, and then the door handle began to turn. Jessica braced against the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Patel scrambled to find anything to block it, grabbing a gurney and shoving it against the frame. The handle jiggled more violently now, the door shaking as if it might splinter under the force. "Find something else to barricade it," Patel hissed, sweat pouring down his face. Jessica glanced around the hallway, her vision blurry with panic. A medical supply cabinet caught her eye. She ran to it, wheeling it toward the door. The screeching sound of its wheels echoed, and the second it hit the gurney, the pounding stopped. Silence. Jessica's breath caught. "Is it gone?" Patel held up a finger, motioning for her to wait. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting faint shadows that danced unnervingly along the walls. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, an unintelligible chorus of raspy voices seeping through the cracks around the door. The sound seemed to crawl into their ears, twisting and echoing inside their skulls. What is that?" Patel stammered, covering his ears. Jessica shook her head, backing away. "We need to get out of here." As they turned to leave, the lights flickered again, plunging the hallway into darkness. This time, they didn't come back on. Jessica fumbled for her phone, switching on the flashlight app. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating Patel's pale, terrified face. "What floor are we even on now?" Patel asked, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Jessica nodded. They began moving down the hallway, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. The hospital, so familiar just hours ago, now felt alien. Its sterile white walls seemed to close in, warped and unfamiliar in the dim light. Every sound felt amplified, the scuff of their shoes, the distant hum of machinery, and their shallow, panicked breathing. Then, the whispers returned. They were louder now, seeming to come from every direction. Jessica swung her flashlight around, trying to pinpoint their source, but the beam only revealed empty rooms and abandoned equipment. "Jessica," Patel whispered, grabbing her arm. "Look." She followed his gaze to the floor. The footprints were back, wet, bare, and impossibly large. They glistened under the beam of her flashlight, trailing down the hallway and around the corner. "Is it leading us somewhere?" Patel asked, his voice barely audible. Jessica didn't respond. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run as far as she could. But something, curiosity, dread, or sheer madness, kept her moving forward. They followed the trail, rounding the corner cautiously. At the end of the corridor stood the John Doe. His body jerked unnaturally, his head tilting to one side as though he were studying them. The dim light from Jessica's phone caught his eyes, and they glinted like shards of broken glass. He wasn't alone. Around him, faint, translucent shapes began to materialize, figures of shadow and frost, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They surrounded him like an army, their whispering voices blending into a cacophony of despair. "What the hell is this?" Patel choked, backing away. Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't know." The John Doe took a step forward, his movement fluid yet wrong, as though gravity itself was bending to his will. The shadowy figures followed, their forms swirling like smoke. One by one, they began to speak. Not in whispers, but in words, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. "You let him wake. You broke the seal. He is coming." "Who's coming?" Jessica demanded, her voice cracking. The figures didn't answer. Instead, the John Doe raised a hand, his fingers clawed and twisted. The lights flickered back on, and for a brief second, Jessica saw it, the thing standing behind him. It was massive, its body a tangle of blackened limbs and empty eyes. Its form shifted constantly, as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. When its gaze fell on Jessica, she felt an icy grip on her chest, as though the air had been sucked from her lungs. "Run!" Patel screamed, grabbing her arm. They bolted, the shadows twisting and surging behind them. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, the exit seeming to move further away with every step. Jessica's legs burned, her lungs heaving, but she didn't dare stop. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The shadows began to close in, their icy tendrils reaching for her. She could feel the cold creeping up her spine, the weight of the thing's gaze boring into her skull. Then, they reached the stairwell. Patel slammed the door shut behind them, his hands fumbling to lock it. Jessica leaned against the wall, gasping for air. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. "Do you think that stopped it?" Patel asked, his voice hoarse. Jessica shook her head. "I don't think anything can stop it." Just as she spoke, the door began to rattle. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time they carried a single chilling message. "You cannot leave. He is awake." Jessica and Patel exchanged a look of pure terror as the door began to splinter, the thing on the other side breaking through. The door burst open with a force that sent Patel flying backward into the stairwell wall. Jessica screamed as the shadows poured through like a living flood, their icy touch brushing against her skin. They twisted and writhed, surrounding the John Doe as he stepped into the stairwell. He was no longer the lifeless corpse they'd seen on the gurney. His body was unnaturally elongated, his eyes black voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. His mouth stretched into a chilling grin as he pointed directly at Jessica. "You called him?" he said, his voice a guttural rasp that echoed in her mind more than her ears. "Now you must finish it!" "What do you mean?" she shouted, backing up against the wall. Patel groaned from where he lay, clutching his side, but he managed to pull himself upright. "You shouldn't have moved me," the John Doe continued, his voice blending with the whispers. "You broke the chain, and now he is free." "Who? Who is free?" Jessica demanded, her voice trembling. The stairwell shook violently, cracks splintering up the walls as if the entire hospital were being torn apart. The shadows swirled faster, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. Patel grabbed Jessica's arm, pulling her toward the next flight of stairs. "Jessica, we have to go!" he shouted. They scrambled downward, the stairs creaking under their weight. The shadows followed, spilling over the edges like water. Jessica could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the whispers now deafening. The stairwell opened into the hospital's basement. They stumbled into a narrow hallway lined with old, rusted equipment. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the flickering fluorescent lights barely illuminated the way. Jessica turned back just in time to see the John Doe descending the stairs, his body levitating slightly above the ground. "This is his domain now," he said, his voice booming. "You can't escape." Patel dragged Jessica into a nearby storage room, slamming the door shut behind them. He jammed a broken mop handle under the knob, his hands shaking violently. Jessica pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "We're trapped," Patel whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do we do?" Jessica's mind raced. She looked around the room, her flashlight illuminating shelves of cleaning supplies and old medical equipment. In the corner, something caught her eye, a small, leather-bound book sitting atop a dusty crate. "What's that?" Patel asked, noticing her gaze. Jessica grabbed the book, flipping through its brittle pages. It was filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes, the text barely legible. One page in particular stood out, a diagram of a circle with intricate runes etched around its edges. This looks like some kind of ritual," Jessica said, her voice tinged with desperation. "Maybe it can stop him." "Stop him? Who are we even trying to stop?" Patel snapped. "This is insane." Before Jessica could answer, the whispers grew louder, the door rattling violently. The shadows began to seep through the cracks, their tendrils reaching for them. Jessica flipped to the next page, scanning the instructions. "It says we need to draw this circle," she said. "It's the only way to seal him." "With what? We don't have anything," Patel shouted. Jessica looked around the room, her eyes landing on a bottle of industrial cleaner. She grabbed it, pouring the liquid onto the floor and using a piece of broken glass to etch the runes. Patel hesitated for a moment before helping, his hands trembling as he carved the symbols. The door splintered behind them, the shadows flooding in like a tidal wave. Jessica worked frantically, completing the circle just as the John Doe entered the room. He stared at them, his twisted grin widening. "You think you can stop him?" he sneered. "It's too late." Jessica ignored him, placing her hands on the edge of the circle and chanting the words scrawled in the book. The air grew heavy, the shadows recoiling as the runes began to glow with an ethereal light. The John Doe screamed, his body contorting as the circle's light enveloped him. The shadows howled, their forms dissipating one by one. The entire room shook, the walls cracking and the floor buckling. "Keep going!" Patel shouted, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. Jessica's voice grew louder, her chant echoing through the room. The John Doe collapsed to his knees, his body flickering like a dying flame. The shadows dissolved into the floor, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the room imploded. Jessica and Patel were thrown backward, the light consuming everything. When Jessica opened her eyes, she was lying on the cold, hard ground. The storage room was gone, replaced by a void of pure white. Patel groaned beside her, his face pale and bloodied. "Did we do it? Is it over?" Jessica sat up, her head spinning. In the distance, she saw a faint figure standing in the void. It was the John Doe, his body now transparent and ghostly. "You've delayed him," he said, his voice hollow. "But he is not gone. He will find you again." Before Jessica could respond, the figure vanished, leaving them alone in the endless expanse of white. As the white void dissolved, Jessica found herself lying on the hospital floor. Her head throbbed as she sat up, disoriented. The flickering fluorescent lights above cast a sickly yellow glow, and the faint hum of electrical equipment returned, grounding her in reality. Patel groaned beside her, struggling to sit up, his shirt smeared with grime and dried blood. The hallway was eerily silent. The shadows were gone, and the suffocating cold had lifted. Jessica clutched her arms, trying to stop them from trembling. Her mind replayed the last moments in the storage room, the implosion of light, the John Doe's final words. "He's not gone," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. Patel looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. What did he mean? That thing, was it even human? Jessica shook her head, her throat dry. I don't think it ever was. They stumbled to their feet, using the wall for support. Patel glanced around nervously, his voice trembling. We need to leave. Right now. Jessica nodded. Every instinct told her to flee, but a gnawing sense of unfinished business tugged at her. Patel, she said, gripping his arm, we need to report this. The hospital isn't safe. Patel stared at her as if she were insane. Report this? To who? What are we even supposed to say, that a possessed corpse and living shadows tried to kill us? Jessica faltered. He was right. Who would believe them? Even as she stood there, it felt like the events they'd just endured were slipping away, like fragments of a nightmare that didn't fully survive waking. They made their way to the stairwell, each step feeling like an eternity. The hospital felt empty now, eerily so. When they finally reached the lobby, the night receptionist was slumped over the desk, snoring softly. Outside, the city lights sparkled under a clear night sky. Everything looked painfully normal. Jessica and Patel stepped into the cool night air, the silence between them heavy. Patel pulled out his phone, checking the time. It's almost 3 a.m. Jessica frowned. We went into the basement hours ago. How is it only 3? Patel looked at her, his face pale. Let's not question it. Let's just get out of here. As they walked to the parking lot, Jessica noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance, a janitor pushing a mop. He moved methodically, his head down. Jessica's blood ran cold when she realized his uniform was covered in fresh, wet stains. Patel, she whispered, grabbing his arm. That's him. Patel followed her gaze, his face blanching. The janitor looked up, locking eyes with them. It wasn't the John Doe, but there was something deeply wrong about his expression. His mouth twitched into a crooked smile, and his voice carried across the lot, low and gravelly. See you soon. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed Patel, dragging him toward her car. They jumped in, slamming the door shut as Jessica fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped out of the lot, the janitor's figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Neither of them spoke as they drove through the city streets, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them. When they finally reached Patel's apartment, he hesitated before getting out. You think we stopped it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica didn't answer. She couldn't. All she could hear was the John Doe's parting words. He will find you again. Patel nodded grimly, as if he'd heard her unspoken thoughts. He stepped out of the car, pausing to look back. Be careful, Jessica. She nodded, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. As Patel disappeared into his building, Jessica sat there, staring into the darkness. For the first time, she realized something she hadn't noticed before. Her rearview mirror was slightly tilted. She adjusted it, her stomach dropping as she caught a glimpse of the back seat. There, sitting motionless, was the faint outline of a figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Jessica screamed, slamming the door open and stumbling onto the pavement. When she looked back, the back seat was empty. She sat there, shaking uncontrollably as the city continued its indifferent hum around her. Whatever had happened in that hospital wasn't over. It had followed her, and it was only the beginning. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a nostalgic trek through the rural stretches of Virginia where the hills roll like green waves and small towns sit tucked between the trees. For Mark and Lisa, it was their annual tradition, an escape from their crowded, high-stress lives in New York City. This year, they had planned to visit a remote but picturesque area known for its abandoned colonial villages. The trip was meant to be an adventure, but by the time they realized they had taken a wrong turn, the GPS was no longer working. "We'll just backtrack," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice steady as she glanced out the car window. The gravel road stretched endlessly, flanked by dense forest on both sides. There was no cell service, no road signs, just the unsettling hum of the engine breaking the oppressive silence. "Easier said than done," Mark muttered, gripping the steering wheel. The road had narrowed, and the trees seemed to close in around them like a living wall. "I don't even remember when we turned off the main road." Lisa checked her phone again. Still no signal. "Great," Mark sighed, slowing down. "We'll turn around and—" His voice trailed off as they rounded a bend, and the forest abruptly gave way to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood a town, or what was left of one. The buildings were ancient, their wooden frames warped and decayed. The dirt streets were lined with tall, brittle grass, and an eerie stillness hung in the air. It looked as if the place had been abandoned for centuries. "That's not on the map," Lisa said, leaning forward. "Do you think anyone lives here?" Mark shook his head, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the empty streets. "Doubt it. But maybe there's a house or something we can check for directions." Reluctantly, Lisa nodded. They pulled into the clearing, parking near what appeared to be an old general store. The air outside was heavy, damp, and carried a faint metallic scent that made Lisa wrinkle her nose. "I don't like this," she said, hugging her arms as they walked toward the store. "Something feels off." Mark didn't respond. He was too focused on the sound of their footsteps crunching against the dirt, echoing too loudly, as if the entire town were listening. The store's wooden door creaked as Mark pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder, and the shelves were bare except for a few rusted tins and broken jars. A cash register sat on the counter, its keys coated in dust. Spiderwebs hung like veils in the corners. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice bouncing back at him. No response. Lisa wandered to the back, her eyes drawn to a collection of photographs tacked to the wall. They were black and white, their edges curling with age. Each photo showed groups of people, men, women, and children, standing in front of the same store. But something about their faces made her stomach tighten. "They're not smiling," she whispered. "What?" Mark asked, joining her. She pointed to the pictures. "Look, none of them are smiling. Isn't that weird? Even the kids." Mark examined the photos and frowned. She was right. The people stared at the camera with blank, almost lifeless expressions. And the more he looked, the more he noticed something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. "Let's get out of here," Lisa said, pulling his arm. They stepped back into the clearing, and that's when they heard it. Faint laughter, high-pitched and echoing from somewhere deep in the town. Mark and Lisa froze, their eyes darting around. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's just go." But as they hurried back to the car, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. The dirt road they had come in on was gone. In its place was an unbroken line of tall, unyielding trees. "This can't be right," Mark said, panic rising in his voice. He walked to where the road had been and pressed his hands against the trees. They were solid, their trunks gnarled and ancient. Lisa spun around, her breath quickening. "Mark, look." He turned. The town's empty streets were no longer empty. Figures stood in the doorways of the buildings, their forms shadowy and still. Mark couldn't make out their faces, but he knew they were watching. "Get in the car!" he said, grabbing Lisa's hand. They sprinted to the vehicle, slamming the doors shut. Mark turned the key and the engine roared to life. As he threw the car into reverse, the figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, almost choking. Lisa covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "Drive, Mark! Just drive!" But no matter how much Mark pressed the gas pedal, the car didn't move. It was as if the wheels were stuck in place. The figures were almost at the car now, their features becoming clearer. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths frozen in grotesque, toothless grins. "Mark!" Lisa screamed, clawing at his arm. Suddenly, the figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing from all directions. Then the world seemed to ripple, the air shimmering like heat waves. Before Mark or Lisa could react, the laughter ceased, and the town disappeared. They were back on the gravel road, the forest surrounding them once again. The car's engine purred steadily, as if nothing had happened. They sat in silence, their breaths ragged. Finally, Mark spoke. "Was that real?" Lisa didn't answer. She was staring at something in her lap, a photograph she had unknowingly grabbed from the store wall. It showed the same unsmiling townsfolk standing in front of the general store, but this time, 2 new faces were in the crowd. Theirs. Mark's heart stopped when he saw their faces in the photograph. His and Lisa's expressions were vacant, devoid of the fear and panic they were experiencing in the moment. They stood there in the photo like they had been part of the town for years. He snatched the picture from Lisa's trembling hands, flipping it over. On the back, there was writing in faded, spidery ink. "Welcome home." Lisa let out a strangled cry, her hands clutching her head as if she were trying to wake up from a nightmare. Mark crumpled the photo and threw it onto the passenger floor, jamming his foot on the gas. The car roared forward, gravel spitting from the tires as they sped down the road. "Just drive, Mark! Don't stop! Don't look back!" Lisa sobbed. He didn't need to be told twice. The forest blurred around them, the trees bending inward like skeletal hands trying to pull them back. The metallic scent lingered, though the town was long gone. Mark's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, every nerve screaming for him to get them as far away as possible. As the car rocketed down the gravel path, Lisa gasped, pointing ahead. "Mark! The road! It's—" The gravel ended abruptly, replaced by a narrow dirt trail that twisted into the dense forest. Mark yanked the wheel, but it was too late. The car skidded, the tires losing traction. They plunged into the underbrush, the vehicle jolting violently as it hit roots and rocks. Finally, the car came to a halt, its front end embedded in a shallow ditch. The engine sputtered and died. Mark groaned, his head pounding from the impact. Lisa was shaking uncontrollably in her seat, her eyes darting around the dark forest. What now?" she whispered. Mark tried the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. He slammed his fist against the wheel. "We walk," he said, his voice strained. "We have to get out of here." Lisa hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "What if we're still there?" Mark glanced back at the road, or what should have been the road. It was gone. In its place stood a wall of trees, their branches tangled and impenetrable. He swallowed hard, refusing to acknowledge the panic clawing at his chest. "We'll find a way," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Stay close to me." They stepped into the forest, the flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The trees seemed to loom closer with each step, their twisted trunks like grotesque figures. The air was thick, humid, and carried a low, almost imperceptible hum. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered. Mark nodded. The hum was growing louder, vibrating in his chest like a swarm of unseen insects. Then it stopped, replaced by a faint whispering. It came from everywhere and nowhere, the words indistinct but filled with malice. "Keep moving," Mark said, gripping Lisa's hand tightly. They stumbled through the underbrush, their breaths ragged. The whispering followed them, growing louder with every step. Shapes flickered at the edge of the flashlight's beam, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. "Mark, I don't think we're alone," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Just keep going," he urged. But the forest had other plans. The trees ahead formed a barrier, their branches knitting together to block their path. Mark swung the flashlight wildly, searching for an opening, but the shadows seemed to close in, herding them like prey. The whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched, cruel, and all too familiar. "It's them," Lisa choked out. "The townsfolk." Mark turned and his blood ran cold. Figures stood among the trees, their hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. The metallic scent was back, stronger than ever. "Run!" Mark shouted, pulling Lisa with him. They sprinted through the forest, dodging branches and roots. The laughter grew louder, echoing in their ears, until it was a deafening cacophony. Mark's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering like a dying candle. Then they saw it. A clearing up ahead, bathed in pale moonlight. Mark pushed Lisa forward, urging her toward the open space. They burst into the clearing, their lungs burning. But the sight before them stopped them in their tracks. The town was there. The same decayed buildings, the same dirt streets. The general store stood at the center, its windows glowing faintly. "No," Lisa whispered, her knees buckling. "No, no, no." Mark shook his head, backing away. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The laughter faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, one by one, the building's doors creaked open. The townsfolk emerged, their empty eyes fixed on Mark and Lisa. They moved in unison, their movements slow and deliberate. "We're not staying here," Mark growled, pulling Lisa to her feet. But as they turned to run, the clearing was gone. The forest surrounded them again, endless and suffocating. The townsfolk were gone too, leaving only the faint metallic scent in their wake. Lisa clung to Mark, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Mark stared into the darkness, his mind racing. Then, from the trees, the whispering returned, closer this time. "We keep moving," he said, gripping her hand. "We don't stop." And so they walked, their footsteps swallowed by the forest, the laughter echoing softly behind them. As Mark and Lisa pressed forward, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, looping in a nightmarish cycle. The flashlight's beam grew weaker, its light barely piercing the oppressive darkness. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground beneath them was pulling them down. The whispering surrounded them, sometimes clear, sometimes like a faint hum in their ears. "I can't do this anymore," Lisa whimpered, clutching Mark's arm. Her legs were trembling and tears streaked her face. "We're not getting out of here." Mark pulled her close, his voice firm despite the panic bubbling inside him. "We are getting out. Whatever this is, it wants us to give up. We can't." As if responding to his defiance, the forest shifted. The trees bent and twisted, creating shapes that resembled human forms, crooked, grotesque, and watching. The air turned colder, the metallic scent now accompanied by an unnatural chill that seeped into their bones. "Do you see them?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The figures among the trees seemed closer now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The laughter returned, soft at first, but rising in a crescendo that rattled their nerves. Mark tightened his grip on Lisa's hand and forged ahead, his steps quickening despite the uneven terrain. He refused to look back, but he could feel them, feel their presence closing in. Then, up ahead, a glimmer of hope. A faint, golden light broke through the darkness, spilling onto the forest floor like a beacon. It was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, malevolent atmosphere around them. "Do you see that?" Mark asked, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. Lisa nodded, her face lighting up with a fragile hope. Maybe it's the way out. They ran toward the light, their fatigue momentarily forgotten. As they approached, the light grew brighter, revealing a small wooden door embedded in the trunk of an enormous tree. The door was intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift and move, almost alive. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the ornate handle. "What if this is another trick?" Lisa looked at him, her eyes desperate. "What choice do we have?" He nodded, his jaw tightening. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The golden light spilled out, momentarily blinding them. They stepped through, bracing themselves for what lay beyond. The door slammed shut behind them, and the light faded, leaving them in a vast open field bathed in moonlight. The forest was gone, replaced by rolling hills and a clear, star-studded sky. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was fresh and clean. "Did we make it out?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling with cautious hope. Mark looked around, his breathing steadying. "I think we—" A shadow flickered at the edge of the field, cutting him off. He turned sharply, his heart sinking. The same figures from the forest stood there, their hollow eyes glowing brighter now, their shapes clearer under the moonlight. But they weren't alone. Behind them, the buildings of the cursed town began to materialize, their outlines shimmering like a mirage. "No," Mark muttered, his fists clenching. "No, this isn't real." The laughter returned, louder and more mocking than ever. The townsfolk began to advance, their movements slow, but deliberate. The ground beneath Mark and Lisa trembled, and the once gentle breeze turned into a harsh, biting wind. Lisa grabbed Mark's arm, her voice rising in panic. "What do we do? We can't go back!" Mark's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. Then, he noticed something, a faint glow coming from his pocket. He reached in and pulled out the crumpled photograph. The image was no longer of them standing lifelessly in the town. Instead, it showed the door they had just come through, now surrounded by fire. Mark stared at the photo, his pulse pounding. "I think this is it," he said, showing it to Lisa. "We have to destroy this." Lisa's eyes widened. "But what if—" "We don't have time to second guess," Mark shouted. "If this is the key, we have to try." The townsfolk were closer now, their whispers mingling with the laughter, creating an unbearable cacophony. Mark grabbed a lighter from his pocket and held it to the photograph. The paper ignited instantly, the flames consuming it faster than seemed natural. As the photograph burned, the ground shook violently and the laughter turned into agonized screams. The figures halted, their forms flickering and distorting like a broken projection. One by one, they dissolved into nothingness, their screams fading into the wind. The town began to crumble, its buildings collapsing into ash. The door behind them glowed brightly, then burst into flames, leaving only a charred outline on the tree. Mark and Lisa stood in stunned silence as the field returned to its serene state. The moonlight shone brighter, and the stars above seemed to twinkle in approval. Lisa turned to Mark, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it, over?" Mark exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping. "I think so." But as they started to walk away, a faint whisper drifted through the air, sending a chill down their spines. "Welcome home!" Mark and Lisa froze in their tracks. The whisper, soft as a breeze, echoed with an unnatural familiarity. Their eyes met, both filled with dread. Slowly, they turned back toward the open field, scanning for the source of the voice. The serene landscape began to shift subtly. The moonlight dimmed, and the once clear sky was now shrouded with thin, swirling clouds. The field itself seemed to ripple, the tall grass swaying unnaturally, as if responding to an unseen force. Lisa clutched Mark's arm, her voice trembling. "Mark, this doesn't feel right." Before he could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A fissure opened in the earth, and from it, a thick black fog spilled forth, snaking toward them like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices, each speaking words too fragmented to understand but dripping with malice. Mark grabbed Lisa's hand and pulled her back. "Run!" They sprinted toward the edge of the field, but with each step, the landscape seemed to stretch farther away. The horizon shifted like a mirage, retreating as they advanced. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the black fog surged closer, consuming everything in its path. Lisa stumbled, and Mark caught her, pulling her to her feet. "We're not stopping," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Suddenly, the ground ahead of them rose, forming a jagged wall of earth that blocked their path. They skidded to a halt, breathing heavily. Behind them, the fog closed in, tendrils reaching out like claws. Mark turned, his eyes darting frantically for an escape. In the center of the field, where the door once stood, a faint glow began to rise. It pulsed like a heartbeat, growing brighter with each throb. Lisa noticed it too. "What is that?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and fear. "I don't know," Mark said, his jaw tightening, "but it's our only shot." Without another word, they ran toward the light, dodging the encroaching fog. The glow intensified, illuminating a circle of grass that remained untouched by the darkness. As they reached it, the light erupted in a blinding flash, forcing them to shield their eyes. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the center of a stone circle, surrounded by ancient, weathered monoliths. Symbols, etched into the stones, glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the light. The fog recoiled, unable to penetrate the circle. Lisa collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. "What is this place?" Mark studied the stones, his mind racing. "I think it's a sanctuary. A safe zone." The whispers outside the circle grew more frantic, and the fog lashed at the invisible barrier, but it couldn't breach the light. From within the swirling darkness, a figure began to form. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadow, but its eyes burned with a piercing, otherworldly light. The figure stepped closer, stopping just outside the circle. Its voice was a deep, guttural echo that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. "You think you've escaped?" it said, a sinister edge to its tone. "You've merely delayed the inevitable." Mark stood protectively in front of Lisa, his fists clenched. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head as if amused. "You trespassed into my domain. You disturbed what was meant to remain buried. Now, you belong to me." Lisa looked up, her face pale. "We didn't mean to. We didn't know." "Ignorance is no excuse," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "The price must be paid." The symbols on the stones flickered. their light dimming. The barrier began to waver, and the fog pressed harder, creeping closer. Mark's mind raced. He felt the photograph in his pocket, its edges singed but still intact. Desperate, he pulled it out and held it toward the figure. "Is this what you want?" The figure recoiled slightly, its burning eyes narrowing. "You dare wield that?" Mark hesitated, then his voice hardened. "This is your connection to us, isn't it? If I destroy this, you lose your hold." The figure let out a guttural snarl. "You know not what you meddle with." Mark grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her to her feet. "Then let's find out." Before the figure could react, Mark tore the photograph in half. The effect was immediate. The fog erupted in a deafening wail, and the figure's form began to dissolve, its shape contorting and collapsing in on itself. The ground shook violently, and the symbols on the stones flared brightly before shattering into shards of light. The light consumed everything, and for a moment, there was only silence. When Mark and Lisa opened their eyes, they were standing at the edge of the forest, the sun rising on the horizon. The town, the fog, the oppressive darkness, everything was gone. The air was fresh, filled with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. Lisa clung to Mark, her voice trembling. "Is it really over?" Mark looked around, his body still tense. "I think so." But as they turned to leave, Mark noticed something on the ground. A fragment of the photograph lay there, charred but intact. He picked it up cautiously, his heart sinking as he saw what was on it. It was a picture of them, standing in the circle of stones with the shadowy figure looming behind them. Its burning eyes stared directly into the camera, and below it, scrawled in ash, were the words, "We are never far.